Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the November meeting of the New York Local ARSC Chapter. And tonight we have a very special guest who is one of the, would I say, pillars of ARSC in many ways, Matt? This is Matt. The pillar, one of a real pill, right? Yes. Pillars of ARSC. This is Matt Barton, who is head of the publications committee for ARSC. And through his efforts, you're going to see the fruits of his labors for the last, what would you say, 2 years on this?
Call it 1 year.
Okay, 1 year.
Most of last year.
And it's the first time that this organization has been able to publish a CD due to the fact that this organization went and had the copyright laws changed, such that this can become legal. Let me introduce Matt. He'll tell you where he works because I can't remember the name of the department he's in at the Library of Congress, but he's the curator of it. We're good friends. We've been talking about doing an awful lot of different projects with the me and the Library of Congress, and then also working on the next ARSC CD, which we're planning for what, the end of 2022 at this rate, Matt?
Sooner than that.
Sooner than that.
Next year.
All right. Well, let me introduce Matt Barton. Matt, it is all yours.
Thank you. Thank you. One of the things, I lived in New York many, many years, and, you move away, you forget all these little things like how hard it is to get from east to west and to find a cab at 6 o'clock in the evening. And anyway. But thank you all for coming. Thank you so much. I'm the recorded sound curator at the Library of Congress. Used to be the Motion Picture Broadcast and Recorded Sound Division, or MBRS. It's now the National Audiovisual Conservation Center, which is located in Culpeper, Virginia, though if you're doing research, you would be going to our office on Capitol Hill. So, and yes, we ARSC released a CD this year, and it was part of a special winter issue. And, this was an idea that's been germinating for a long time. Seth, I know, proposed doing something like this at least 20 years ago, and other people have talked about it, but it always ran aground on the rocks of copyright, because you had this unusual situation with copyright in the US, whereas most of the rest of the world, there's a fixed term. And, it was 50 years, then it was 70 years. It's changed, but it was a fixed term. It was predictable. Whereas sound recordings were not even eligible for copyright until the 1970s here in the US. And that's a long, long story. But the long and short of it is that until January 1st of this year, commercial recording from 1890, which is pretty much when they began, was still protected. All these recordings from years when a book or a movie or something else, a composition, would be in the public domain, were still protected, which is not to say that people did not, tap dance around that law, but ARSC being an organization of both that includes collectors and archivists, and the Library of Congress, which has been a member since the very beginning in the 1960s, Library of Congress, which is the home of the Copyright Office. It was, simply not going to happen that, we could do something like this. But ARSC was instrumental in getting these laws changed as part of the Music Modernization Act. And the result now is that anything released before 1923 is now in the public domain, and there's more to come. It'll be on a rolling basis. There'll be more each year. But for now, it's December 31st, 1922, or earlier. So that's a little background, and since we were waiting for this change with bated breath, we wanted to have something ready to celebrate it. And we decided that would be a CD that will be tucked inside a special issue of the journal, which would serve mainly as notes for the CD. And that's what some of you already have, and if you want to leave with one tonight, we can do something about that.
You have it right here.
Yeah.
$12 a piece.
Yeah. But let's cut to the chase here. So this is the title of my talk. I think I put something else on the description, but I went with this. Let's go to the next slide. Not sold in stores. Not sold in stores like K-Tel Records. Who remembers K-Tel Records? Good, good, good. Because for me, as a child of the 70s, K-Tel and Ronco and others, that's the gold standard for multi-artist, multi-genre anthologies. So obviously all of this stuff is still, well within copyright. Let's go to the next slide. Initially, I was kind of picturing something like this. All these favorites of the pre-1923 era. But this is the stuff that people generally know, like Caruso and Billy Murray and others. We wanted to dig deeper than that, and go beyond the kind of discs that you can still find in thrift shops, actually. Go to the next slide. This is an exchange I had with Tim Brooks, the president of ARSC, which I described. This is sort of what we arrived at. A program of 20 to 30 recordings released as early as circa 1890 through December 31st, 1922. While the final selection won't have a track from each year necessarily, the goal is to draw from the whole era and to represent as many styles, peoples, and formats as possible. Spoken word recordings are eligible for inclusion, not just musical ones. Very important. Nothing should be chosen for rarity alone, and listenable sound quality is important. Any recording chosen should be a strong example of whatever it is, and if it's historically significant, so much the better. Next. So, where to begin? In the early days, we were thinking about this and put out an open call at last year's ARSC'S online conference asking for contributions. I was looking for something else on the 12-inch 78 shelves of the library, and I came across one of these Vocalion red records, which you see from time to time. And this one was credited to Actors' Equity, the union for performers. And I thought, well, that's interesting. And somebody had put up a copy of it on YouTube, and I listened to that and just thought, well, this is a good way to start off. And what you're going to hear is excerpts from side one, which features these 5 performers. That's Richard Barthelmess, Joseph Cawthorn, Florence Moore, DeWolf Hopper of Casey at the Bat fame, and Raymond Hitchcock. Except for Barthelmess, who was a film star, the others are mainly comic actors and musical comic actors. DeWolf Hopper, it's a shame that we only know him for Casey at the Bat. He was a renowned performer of Gilbert and Sullivan, among other things, and it was for him that the role of El Capitan was written in the 1890s. Most of them recorded very little, if at all. So let's go and hear how the disc opens. The next slide.
Hello, Joseph Cawthorn. Well, Dick Bottleman, how are you, old man? Have you made any records lately? No records, but a lot of pictures. Do you know that I got a bad cold just watching that ice scene from way down east? Hello, who's the big fella coming up here? Well, as I live and breathe, the Wolf Hopper.
Hello, Joe. How are you?
Hello, Wolfie. How are you?
What are you going to do?
I'm going to recite.
So am I.
Are you? That's fine. Well, I'll go first.
Oh, no. Now let's match for it.
Have you got a coin?
Sure.
Well, it's the first time in your life.
Tails.
Tails. Well, I guess you win.
Ha-ha. He sipped the nectar from her lips as 'neath the moon they sat and wondered if ever a man before had drunk from a mug like that.
Very good, Wolfie. Very good. And your voice registers fine, but you've got no finish.
Why, there's a scream at the finish.
No. You must have a punch at the finish of a thing like that. Let me put a finish to it.
Go ahead.
She used to sit upon his lap as happy as could be. But now it makes her seasick He has water on the knee.
Oh, rotten.
Is that so? Come on, let's get away from here. Here comes Raymond Hitchcock, and they tell me he's going to sing.
Oh, let's escape. Take you around, fellas. I'm going to sing. When you're all dressed up and no place to go. Why, Florence Moore, whatever is the matter?
Oh, Raymond Hitchcock, what is this world coming to? A mother said, children, go to the saloon and get your ice cream sodas, and then stop at the drugstore and bring your father home.
Good night, Florence.
You can have your country seashore, but I love the place you call Broadway, when everything is bright and gay, spending night time in today, always something gaily doing. I want to say you never go away. You have to hand it to that up and place Broadway. Higher cliff, you can have your country seashore, but I love the place you call Broadway, when everything is bright and gay, spending night time in today, always something gaily doing. I want to say you never go away. You have to hand it to that up and place Broadway. Higher cliff, you can have your country seashore, but I love the place you call Broadway, when everything is bright and gay, spending night time in today, always something gaily doing. I want to say you never go away. You have to hand it to that up and place Broadway. Higher cliff, you can have your country seashore, but I love the place you call Broadway, when everything is bright and gay, spending I'll never make it. Something gaily doing. I want to say you never go away. You have to hand it to that up and place Broadway.
Okay, and I wanted to keep the tempo up. And Sounds of Africa, suggested by David Sager, seemed like a good one. By the way, that last, the disc itself came from the collection of Dave Giovannoni, as did this one, though David Sager chose it. And in the search, he became aware of an alternate take, not unknown, but pretty rare. So this is an alternate take of Sounds of Africa, Eubie Blake, 1921, I believe. Did you advance? No. Okay, one more. There we are. Oh. Here. These are from the first sessions of Arturo Toscanini and the Scala Orchestra. Toscanini was not a fan of recording in the acoustic era, and he had resisted it to this point, but Victor made him an offer he couldn't refuse. He had rebuilt the La Scala Orchestra after World War I, and they largely, I don't know if they entirely the tour is entirely underwritten by Victor or almost.
Victor made an offer
Yeah.
of a certain amount of money to help fund it, and he essentially did it just to help to pay for the orchestra.
Yeah, yeah. But part of it was he had to record. Now, Toscanini being Toscanini, very little was remotely satisfactory to him. And they did issue, how many sides? I mean,
Was it
16, you know, a nice set of recordings, and of course the performances are excellent and the sound is excellent. They couldn't record all 97 members, I don't think, but you know, they made do. Toscanini, you know, was, I think, you know, something had to be released, but nothing was released that he didn't approve of. But he also said he'd never record again. Well, about 3 years later, microphones are introduced, and he starts to warm up to the idea of recording.
Matt, may I
Yep.
add something? In the Toscanini legacy at the New York Public Library, there are scores, his scores that he modified when he was doing these recordings. In others, when they said they couldn't use double basses,
Yeah.
doubling with tubas, and not using celli. So there were there's an incredible rearrangement of the last movement of the Beethoven Fifth that he did for these recording sessions. There is, what was it? There was a Barber Seville Overture and a Star Spangled Banner, recorded but never approved.
No.
And according to Robert Hupke's discography, only 2 of the metal parts to all the sides survive as of 1962.
So let's hear a little bit of the overture of The Secret of Suzanne, which was a pretty recent work at that time. The overture for this opera. Suzanne's secret, Seth tells me, is that she smoked.
Right, Joe?
So, one more.
Oh, next slide.
Yep. No, not that one.
Okay, back we go.
Should be hearing something. Go back one. Okay. All right, advance.
James has the media there.
But there should be a sound file.
Sound file attached to this.
Yes.
We heard it just before when you were.
Yeah, we heard it. It's there. Go back once again and let's try one more time. Okay. Yep. Okay, next. Okay. This disc was from the collection of ARSC member Rainer Lotz. It's the only one that he's ever seen. It's the only one that anybody has ever seen, at least since it was pressed back in 1912. And this is just what it says, a Balalaika performance of The Temptation Rag. And Alexander Wolkowski was Russian. He left Russia in 1905 with his family troupe. He left in early 1905. I don't think the impending revolution of '05 had anything to do with it. He had gigs lined up in the US and was mainly in the circus world. Toured with top circuses, including Ringling Brothers, toured America and Central America and possibly other places in the 1890s and early 20th century, and he was undoubtedly exposed to ragtime in those years. So in 1912, though, he's back in Europe, working in Germany at the Winter Garden, and this is part of his set. Rainer initially could not find anything out about them. I stumbled on some clippings in circus magazines, and also a review by an English critic who saw the group in Berlin commented on the novelty of hearing tunes like Dixie played on Balalaika. The rest of the session, though, only produced Russian repertoire. So let's go through the next slide here. There's the whole troupe. One more. Some other views. That's Wolkowski with his wife Maria there. One more, and we'll hear something. Here we go. Next slide, please. Okay. After the original Dixieland Jazz Band made their recordings, 1917 and 1918, and really jump-started a whole craze for jazz, which reached England and Europe, notices like this started to appear in trade papers. And a West Coast band leader named Art Hickman, who was a significant band leader, was approached about touring England. His records were being sold there, and it seemed like a good idea, but Hickman had too many gigs in the US, but he recruited a group to go over and tour for him. They weren't pretending to be Art Hickman, but they was sort of like, the Gene Goldkid Orchestra or something like that. It was called Art Hickman's New York London Five. They were all American musicians, and they were quite popular in England and made records. Let's keep going. That's Art Hickman at the drum kit there. This is his real group. And next shot. That's a really good acoustic recording and also a really good transfer. And we have Jonathan David Holmes, who's a collector in England, to thank for that, and also Mark Beresford of England for this picture, which is unique, especially with the autographs of the musicians themselves. And here we have the Four Sicilians. This is a record made in New York in 1919. The Four Sicilians cut, I believe, 100 sides in the space of 6 or 7 years. For Victor and Columbia, very popular group, and they are. I think this is a kind of interesting case of sort of a parallel history. I mentioned the ODJB a moment ago. This is an example of the kind of group that was, you might have found working in New York at the same time, which is not to say that they played jazz, but as you listen to it, imagine a young Italian-American growing up with music like this. And I think it was good preparation for playing jazz. They don't swing, they don't improvise, but the music has a lilt and an energy and a lyricism that is very simpatico with jazz. This disc was contributed by Giuliana Fugazzotto of Italy, who has also written a book, a beautiful book, available only in Italian, but worth seeking out even if you don't speak the language, because it's full of beautiful illustrations, but also it's got a CD of the group with 23 tracks. This is one of them. Next slide. Slide. Blanche Marchesi is best remembered as a singing teacher, which her mother was as well, and only made a handful of recordings, and her first session was almost lost to history because she ran afoul of Nellie Melba. Her mother had taught Nellie Melba. You'd think there'd be some lingering gratitude, but apparently she was recording repertoire that Melba was also known for and wanted to record herself. And it is said that Melba told HMV to pull Blanche Marchesi's records off the market or she wouldn't record for them. So only a handful, I think 5 or 6 copies of this disc survive.
Can I add something here?
Sure.
Okay. This recording came through Larry Holdridge, the great vocal dealer. He had sold it to somebody in England. The person died. The family asked, can you broker back the collection? He said he got it back. The copy that he had sold him came back, had a half moon crack in it. So what we have here is a recording of a disc that it doesn't exist anymore. And according to Larry, there may have been 5 of them. Now there are 4.
Right.
So
Fortunately, it was a good one. And Seth did his usual good job transferring it. So let's hear a little bit of Blanche Marchesi from 1906. Slide. Okay. This photograph comes from the collection of ARSC member Cristobal Diaz, the great Latin American discographer. And this is the Orquesta Felipe Valdes. And in spite of the fact that Felipe Valdes recorded extensively over many years and was also a published composer with many works to his name, we know almost nothing about him. But a good band leader, and was fortunate to, I don't know who was the engineer for this session in Havana, Cuba, but I think you'll hear that they must have spent a lot of time working out the balance and just the choreography of musicians stepping forward, stepping back throughout the performance. So the next slide, please. That the disc and transfer came from Mike Kiefer. Next one, please. Okay, Olly Oakley, who recorded hundreds of banjo solos from the turn of the century into the 1920s. Real virtuoso of the instrument called the zither banjo. It had a 6th drone string on it. And this is one of his earliest recordings, the Wallaby Polka, which was written by another banjo player, Alf Wood. This one is from the collection of Paul Cherish, who lives out in Bell Harbor, a great pioneer of the study of early recordings, and is now in the collection of the Library of Congress. So next slide. Next one. Okay, La Niña de los Pen, the great flamenco singer. From her first session in Madrid, 1909, the guitarist is Ramon Montoya. This comes from Jonathan Ward of Excavated Shellac fame. Let's go. please. All right, this is the contribution of ARSC member Steve Smolian, and it's notable for being the first recording, or from the first session, for the Stroh violin. And the year is wrong, it's actually 1904. This was a device, you see there was a horn mounted on the instrument to give it more volume, to make it record better on acoustic recordings. Though it recorded fairly well, and certainly nobody had made more violin recordings than this gentleman, Charles Dalmain, who you might call him the first great studio musician, or certainly one of them. He made hundreds, perhaps thousands of appearances. He was quite versatile. He played with the New York Philharmonic, but he's also the one sawing away on Arkansas Traveler on the famous Len Spencer record. For this session, he chose this interesting program piece, Donkey and Driver, which I think he must have thought it particularly suited to the Stroh violin, especially some of the effects of the donkey itself that he draws from the instrument. So, New York. Oh, I don't know. It's a Columbia. I don't know where they would have in 1904. Yeah. It's the next. Pretty deep, huh? Yeah. I think, let's go back just for a moment. As I said, there have been plenty of recordings of the violin before this, and many of them featuring Dalmain, but I think one thing that just occurred to me now was that, with that amplification, the pianist didn't have to hold back. He can really pound, and it's okay.
This thing's supposedly held under your chin?
Yeah. Yeah, and I know a violinist who's did a session with one, and she said it gets pretty painful after a few minutes. So next slide. Okay, Knoll and McNeil, A.H. Knoll, Marie McNeil, very popular cornet duet from 1888 to 1901, and they continued to work apart after that. Very popular musicians, and considered to be, among the very best on their instruments. They did one session for Berliner, 10 discs, and that's it. And this is a disc that came from Dave Giovannoni's collection, pretty good shape for a Berliner. And the thing that occurs to me, the date here, 1898, well, this was popular music at the time, along with ragtime and band music and so on. But this is very much in the mainstream of popular music, and this is what is playing. What you could hear at the time that musicians like Louis Armstrong, Bix Beiderbecke, and others were born. And again, it's not jazz by any stretch of the imagination, but it's what they grew up on. And well, let's just hear some of it. Next slide. Okay. Next, please. Edward Jedlička. I'm not going to try and pronounce that title. That's The Way of the World. It's a rough translation of it. This was made here in New York in the Czech community. Jedlička was an entrepreneur and started making cylinders for the burgeoning Czech community. And this is one that was donated by a family member of Jedlička about 60 years ago to the Library of Congress. Dick Spotswood in the 1970s came upon the cylinders and got them transferred. And we really have him to thank that, for this particular recording, which is from the Library of Congress, but also for bringing Jedlička to the attention of people back in the Czech Republic, including Philip Scheer, who's with the National Museum in Prague and who has done really terrific work researching the early days of Czech recording. And the earliest days of Czech recording appear to have been in the United States, and they appear to have been the work of Edward Jedlička. And this is an immigrant song. He's essentially singing about all the things that he doesn't like so much about the United States. He doesn't really fit in. But then the refrain, he shrugs and says, but that's the way of the world. Well, what can you do? So let's hear a little bit of Jedlička.
U nás se mnohé slečinky, když vyjdou z dohledu maminky, a rýšem se hnedka voní, žádný Čech u nich nepochodí, možná to na světě věc. Po svatbě by ale Čecha brala před.
Next. All right, this is from the collection of Chris King, who is the editor of the ARSC Journal and one of the authorities on Greek recordings like this one, Takis Zakis, which Chris, in his research, has determined is probably a pseudonym for another musician. Nevertheless, or rather, pseudonym for another musician who did make more than a few recordings here in New York, and then appeared to be lost to history. And Chris has done what he can to reconstruct his life, and it's too involved to repeat here. But I definitely commend his note for this in the ARSC Journal. Let's hear a little bit of Takis Zakis. Unusual artists of the early recording era and unusual recording. This is W.O. Beckenbaugh, the leather-lunged auctioneer. If you attended ARSC in Baltimore a few years ago, Patrick Feaster presented on Beckenbaugh, and I didn't know anything about him before that. And this recording, again, is from Giovannoni's collection. It's one of the few that Patrick Feaster doesn't have. He's done great research on Beckenbaugh, who was a real-life auctioneer. He wasn't an actor playing the part. He was an auctioneer, with a following of people who weren't necessarily there to buy anything. It's just that he was so entertaining, he was so funny, and he, more than almost anyone else, perhaps, in the 1890s, he saw the potential in recordings to put over a kind of audio theater, because it isn't just him selling goods. Many of his records, he's selling things that could not be sold, or it's a satire of current events. He did one where he's selling off leftover items from the 1893 Chicago Exposition. In this case, it's sort of one of the first Christmas records, I guess you could say, because it's he's auctioning off lots on Christmas Eve, and the record ends with a great, Merry Christmas and lots of horns and bells ringing. We're going to hear something a little earlier from the middle of the record. Let's go to the next slide.
Now, come on, don't keep us waiting. Come on for the next lot, please. Now, the next lot is a mechanical locomotive, worth $10. If it's worth a cent, it's worth $10. What shall I pay for it? Go on and start it. I have $1, $1, $1, $1, $1, $1, $1, $1, $1, $1. Now we're off now, let's go. $1 and a quarter, $1, $1, $1, $1, $1, $1, $1, $1, $1, $1, $1, $1, $1, $1, $1, $1, $1, $1, $1, $1, $1, $1, $1, $1, $1, $1, $1, $1, $1, $1, $1, $1, $1, $1, $1, $1, $1, $1, $1, $1, $1, $1, $1, $1, $1, $1, $1, $1, $1, $1, $1, $1, $1, $1, $1, $1, $1, $1, $1, $1, $1, $1, $1, $1, $1, $1, $1, $1, $1, $1, $1, $1, $1, $1, $1, $1, $1, $1, $1, $1, $1, $1, $1, $1, $1, $1, $1, $1, $1, $1, $1, $1, $1, $1, $1, $1, $1, $1, $1, $1, $1, $1, $1, $1, $1, $1, $1, $1, $1, $1, $1, $1, $1, $1, $1, $1, $1, $1, $1, $1, $1, $1, $1, $1, $1, $1, $1, $1, $2, sold at $2.
These records are full of sound effects like that, which is quite a balancing act for the 1890s. To get all that in there, you know, and have it register properly and not overwhelm the horn. So W.O. Beckenbauer, the leather-lunged auctioneer. So next, please. All right, this was contributed by Jehun Suk, a member of ARSC, a Korean, who has done really fantastic research into the early recording era of Korea, which not all the records were made in Korea. Some were made in Tokyo during the period when Japan ruled Korea. And this is one from 1913. Songman Gap was a practitioner of pansori, a style of epic narrative singing and poetry, stories that could last 3, 4, even 5 hours, as this one does in performance. This is the Song of 10 Lashes, part of this drama about star-crossed lovers, and in which a woman is punished severely for refusing the advances of a highly placed magistrate. Let's hear a little bit from the Song of 10 Lashes. Songman Gap is the gentleman on the right wearing the hat. Next to him is the percussionist that he worked with, and these are two other Korean recording artists of the period. And that's a disc that it covers that performance covers two sides of a disc. Both sides are on the ARSC CD, but you know, it's 6 minutes from a performance of perhaps 4 or 5 hours. So, next, please. Chiquinha Gonzaga, there she is, still revered till this day in Brazil as a great composer and innovator. Her life was the subject of, I believe, a 38-part miniseries on Brazilian television about 20 years ago. I can just imagine. And we're very lucky to have this disc. Mike Kiefer transferred this from a disc owned by Sherwin-Dunner. Discs of this era, South America and Brazil, very, very rare. And discs in good condition, rarer still. This is one in good condition. So let's hear this is Corta Jaca. Dick Spotswood, who put me on the track of Chiquinha Gonzaga performances. It took a while, as I say, you know, to find a good one like that in such good shape. But very pleased that we could do it. The next one. For Dabney, this was contributed by Tim Brooks, who's the current president of ARSC, Dabney is probably best known today for having written Shine, the song. He was a leading band leader and well-traveled. He spent several years in Haiti before returning to New York, and was the band of choice for the parties given by the Ziegfelds. And he's of some significance in the history of early jazz. Hasn't really received his due, partly because his records are so rare, and they were recorded vertically. So, you know, rare records, harder to play than usual. Fortunately, Tim has a good copy, and Tim knows what he's doing, so we've got a good copy of this one. So for Dabney, Slide and Sid. Next. Oh, looking at my notes here. You go back one. Go back. Go, yeah. Okay. All right. My note is wrong. So go to the next that image there. Okay. So this is "Sail On" by the Billy Sunday Chorus, mixed chorus of 2,500 voices. Yes. This was recorded a few miles from here, a few miles north, at a tabernacle built for Billy Sunday. This is what he would do because he was such a well-known evangelist who drew thousands of people. There were often no local venues that could hold them, so they would build these temporary tabernacles just for him. And this one was built in what is now the, not far from the where the Polo Grounds once stood in Upper Manhattan. And this was in the spring of 1917 when the U.S. had just entered World War I. Billy Sunday was all in on that. And the hymn, the choice of hymn is really interesting. You know, it's got a maritime theme, but it's at the time that this is being made, the first troop ships are leaving from the harbor in New York, carrying young men to fight in World War I. And of course, some of them would have been the children of people in this chorus. Maybe even a few people in this chorus eventually found themselves overseas fighting. So it sort of captures a moment in history. And it's a remarkable recording, 2,500 voices, led by Homer Rodeheaver, a great figure in gospel music. It was Kevin Mungans, next slide. Kevin Mungans, author of this book, that's Billy Sunday, literally thumping a Bible. And this recently published book on Homer Rodeheaver by Kevin, I was talking to him and he told me about this record. I had never heard of it. Well, we tracked down a copy. David Sager did the transfer. And next slide here. This is the scene outdoors. That's the tabernacle that was built. The next. That's what it looked like inside. And Victor sent up a crew to make a recording of the assembled choir. And two things are really remarkable about this. One is the performance. Rodeheaver, was just a great choir leader, a great singing teacher himself. And to get a group like that working together for an actual on-site recording session in those days, I think is really quite an achievement. And also what the Victor engineers managed to do here, because the dynamics on this recording are really striking. So, you know, what Rodehaver is able to draw from the choir and what the engineers were able to capture. So let's hear some of Sail On. I dream that one day the metal parts for that will turn up, you know. Next slide. Okay. The United States Volunteer Ambulance Service is a story in itself. Some very famous people did this. Among them, Ernest Hemingway and Walt Disney were ambulance drivers over there. And this is a group that got together at the training camp for the drivers in Allentown, Pennsylvania. Musicians tend to find each other in those kind of situations, and they were there for a while. So they got together and just started playing for their own amusement and for events at the camp. And this led to actually a show called Goodbye Bill, Bill being Kaiser Wilhelm, which was actually on Broadway for a short time in early 1918. Then the band stayed together and appeared in that, and then they were sent overseas. And miraculously, they were all sent to northern Italy. And they kept the group going there and were playing again for U.S. soldiers, but also for local people in that part of Italy. And it eventually led to an invitation to record for Phonotypia. Now, this is an extremely rare record. At the time we were doing this, this was one of 2 known copies. And Rainer Lotz was able to procure this from Mark Beresford, whose transfer this is and whose disc it is. A third one has surfaced, and that was, I'll take credit for that. I didn't find, I actually reached the grandchild and grandniece of one of the musicians in the band, Charles Keck. And it turned out that the family had actually done an oral history with Keck, which they self-published. We even had a copy of it at the Library of Congress. This is the kind of thing you can find at the Library of Congress. And it's about Keck's whole life, which is very interesting, but he has a lot to say about this experience. Before they came over, while I was still in New York, they would, when they were finished with their show for the night, they would go see the original Dixieland Jazz Band who were playing at that time. And, so they were, really, steeped in the early jazz scene. And they made a number of recordings. This is until recently, was the only one that had surfaced. Library of Congress got 2 more from Keck's family. So, we'll know a little bit more about what they sounded like. It's an unusual a group for a jazz band, essentially a string section with rhythm accompaniment. But here's a taste of what they sounded like. In addition to Italy, this picture was actually taken in France. They got around some while they were over there. And it would have been, you know, the first real exposure that a lot of people in Europe had to jazz. So they were over there at the same time that James Reese Europe was. And just kind of again, sort of this parallel history that you find in the world of recordings sometimes. So one more to play for you. Only picture I know of this group, Abrego and Picasso, of whom very little is known in spite of the fact that they made quite a few recordings, cylinders, for Edison from 1902 to 1910. What became of them after the Mexican Revolution is not known. And we really don't know much about them except for their names. But apparently collectors have found their recordings throughout Latin America, in Cuba and in South America. So, you know, they sold a few records. So the record, our record, the CD, begins with hello, and it ends with adios, adios, Abrego and Picasso. I made a mistake here. I said this is recorded in 1909. It's actually recorded in 1904, but it was issued again by Edison, and this version is from 1909. Actually, I think I'm getting that wrong. I think it's a bit later. Well, okay. I'll have to get, I'm sorry. My apologies to John Levin, whose recording this is and his transfer too, but my memory's failing me, but it's all in the notes to the CD, so. Adios, adios.
Adiós, adiós. Por los señores Abrego y Picasso, fonograma editor.
That's all, folks. I'll take questions if you have any. Thank you. Thank you. And thanks for waiting. I had, you know, quite a time getting over here. I'll remember to leave earlier.
Any questions? You're all stunned by this? You have nothing to say. Joe, could you go back to a picture? I think I can identify the Toscanini one when they're on the boat. I think I know who one of the guys is standing there next to Toscanini. Go all the way back to the beginning.
Working on it.
I know, I'm working on it. Yeah. Any day now. Huh?
Gotta go with the tech.
Hello, Tech. How are we doing?
We're almost there.
They were fun. Okay. I think the rather fat person in the bowler, that may be Orestes, who was the piccolo player in the orchestra. Leave it to being the biggest and heaviest guy in the orchestra, played the smallest instrument.
We didn't really hear him on that side.
Huh? Well, actually, you would know him better. He wound up as the accompanist to Florence Forster Jenkins during her concerts. Whenever they did the flute, pardon me? Yeah, with McMoon. When they do Low Hair, the Gentle Lark, and they need the flute solo, he was the one that used to play those.
Yes.
In fact,
Did you ever talk to him again?
yeah, there's an interview with him. Ben Grauer did for The Man Behind the Legend about 1963. He talks about his experiences making those records.
He has a question.
Yes, do we know how the La Scala Orchestra came to be recorded in Camden? Were they touring or what?
Yes.
Yeah, this was the famous tour to rebuild the orchestra.
Yeah.
That had been devastated, and the executives at the Victor Talking Machine Company, I think, came up with $50,000 according to
Lot
what
of money.
money,
Lot of
and they
money.
said, "Come and record. We'll give you the $50,000." No, it's to promote the tour and to pay the musicians. And the story goes, after the old man got done there with all the rejects, someone at the Victor Talking Machine Company says, "I hope he doesn't come back. He's going to bankrupt us." There was a number of takes and retakes.
Yeah.
Many of the things they did in December when they started.
There
he
were
went
3 or
back
4
in March, had to
sessions
be
from
back. Yeah.
December to March.
Right.
Yeah.
And certain things they did in December he didn't like. When they came back in March, had to do it again.
There was some critic who I remember writing about later on said that at that time Toscanini was touring with a horrible La Scala orchestra.
Yeah, it was not known as a great ensemble. He tried his darndest with it. Essentially because the whole thing had fallen into complete disarray because of World War I.
Yeah, I mean, World War I is lurking behind so many of these recordings.
Yeah.
You know, figures in the story in one way or another. But that was not deliberate, you know. I just think it, you know, as the selection came together, you know, the connections between things became apparent, and it looked as though for a while, it looked as though we couldn't get that recording by the U.S. Ambulance Corps, but I definitely wanted to put on the Billy Sunday. Well, then, you know, that transfer was made available, and you know, the two of them just, you know, most natural connection there.
The thing is, if anybody doesn't have that, no, you can hear me. If anybody doesn't have that booklet, the issue, the material in it is wonderful to read.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I got it, I read it,
Yeah.
I listened to it, then I went back and I listened and read it together,
Yeah.
then I went back and I just read it again.
Yeah. Well, you know, it was. I spent a lot of time on the sequencing, you know, and I think what I hope was achieved was a record that is, you know, entertaining and interesting and enjoyable from start to finish, whether you know the stories or not. If your ears are open, if you like different kinds of music and you're open to new things, because there were a lot of things here that I'd never heard before, styles that, you know, I was unfamiliar with, like that Korean record.
One of the stuff, it was the Japanese recording. I said he definitely didn't study with Marchesi.
Well, no.
The style of singing, the language, and everything else is it's not based on anything that we were taught.
Yeah.
Yes.
Forget it.
Yes. Okay,
Go
Joe.
back to telling.
Be nice, otherwise we don't get
Yeah.
the club record.
Anyway, we did this. It was, you know, to celebrate, you know, the creation finally of a public domain for sound recordings in the U.S. And we got a nice review from the Syncopated Times, where the writer, whose name escapes me right now, said that the whole thing has a celebratory air. And I read that and I just said, thank you. You know, that was the idea. You know, that's just to celebrate, you know, the change in the law, but also just, you know, the riches that are available in this era that is for most people still underappreciated, underexplored.
Any other questions?
Yeah, nice.
Yes, Joe.
Yep.
When you were talking about copyright earlier, that the recordings weren't really under copyright till the 1970s. But how did it work before that when they had the 28-year copyrights?
Well, the recordings were not eligible for that. What you had was a whole series of laws that varied from state to state, which the recording companies were able to get passed. You know, really in self-defense. You know, yeah, from state. The laws varied from state to state, so it could be very complicated. But still, it was. You know, they needed that. They needed to fight piracy, because piracy was a reality of the recording business from very early on. So they got those laws passed.
No,
They were.
I'm going back to when I was a teenager.
Yeah.
And when I was in my 20s, and you had Victor recordings, let's say Crusoe and all that stuff.
Yeah.
Nobody ever dared put them out on any other label until after 56 years whereas they put everybody else out. They put Columbia's out.
But even Caruso, because Caruso is one of the few artists of that period whose recordings have remained in print.
No, but I'm talking about any of them on Victor.
Yeah.
You never see them on any of the American labels, like Scala or Orchestra or anything like that.
Yeah,
But
the
they have
reissues,
all
yeah.
Columbia's. No,
However, Caruso's were among the most of the pirated when they were issued. Remember, they would go out of the country
No, I know
and they
that,
put the label opera discs on them and then import them back.
Yeah.
No, I'm just saying that they never did though. So Victor must have gone after these people, I would think.
Oh yeah. No, it's still a valuable property. And there was a, it's 15 or 20 years ago, Naxos lost a court case over their Caruso reissues, which were legal really almost anywhere else in the world, but not in the U.S. And they lost that court case. Now it's irrelevant because the law has changed.
Right.
You can put out any Caruso recording you want to.
But there was also something else too at the time. They went after Naxos because of that, what was it, 50-year copyright lapsing. They were terrified that they were going to start taking Mario Lanza recordings and putting them out and making a fortune on them.
Well, the list,
Yeah.
and Mario, and a few years later, you get the Beatles, and Mario Alonso's
Right.
contemporary with Elvis. So it was a big
and
big
Elvis
problem
Presley
for
was
them.
the other thing too,
Yeah.
right?
Big problem for them.
Yeah. However, in the early '60s, when the Beatles hit here, there were all these pirates. I had as a kid on the Black Swan label 2 of their biggest hits.
Swan, Swan was not a bootleg.
Oh, it wasn't?
That was a
I
legitimate
was always
release,
under the
yeah.
impression it was.
Yeah, no, because
Okay.
the Beatles were far afield now, but you had that situation where these Beatles recordings were coming out on other labels apart from Capitol, and that's because Capitol had passed on all their early recordings, so they became available to other labels, which is why VJ releases the first Beatles album.
So quite a film stuff was.
Yeah. So it was, the Swan, Tolly, Atlantic put out one. These were all legitimate releases. They,
okay.
it was because Capitol had turned them down. Who are these guys? There's no future in this. So yeah, that's why at one point, the Beatles have 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 slots on the hit parade. They were on 5 different labels.
Gotcha.
That's how it happened.
And those were all pretty much like the Swans. They were all singles, 45s.
Yeah.
And they sold like hotcakes.
Oh,
That
yeah.
I remember.
It all sold. Yeah. So.
Yeah,
In
years
about
ago,
100 years, we'll be putting out an ARSC CD that has the Beatles on it, and
you're going to be around the program?
I don't know.
All right, Joe, anything? Any thoughts?
No, it just interested me. Well, how about the Lanza recording, the ones that come out now, do they come out on the license or what?
Currently in this country, yeah.
Yeah.
So, but I think they're all available. Yes.
Copyrights are this, I noticed you played only studio stuff. What about off-air, which I guess is later? So.
Well, there really aren't any radio recordings from this period. That's a whole other ball of wax.
Right.
Yeah, because those are not. These were commercial recordings issued, sold at the retail level. Surviving radio recordings are a whole different ball of wax, and radio could be very Well, it can be very problematic because. Unions are involved, actors unions, musicians unions. There are underlying copyrights on the music. So radio recordings can be very problematic from a copyright
And also the
standpoint.
network where it was coming from.
Yeah.
I know the story I heard on the inside when they did the Toscanini material to reissue it. Any of the operas or live material that were from broadcasts, our BMG at the time had to relicense the contract they had from NBC Radio because they were using their lines to record it.
Right. Not sold in stores.
Not sold in stores.
Okay.
Any other thoughts? Any questions? None?
All right.
Matt,
so
you
much for
deserve
coming.
quite a round of
Thank you.
applause for this. And we expect to see you again. You always come up with something great.
One of these days.
One of these days. All right. We're going to have our next meeting on Wednesday, December 14th And what are we calling it, Joe?
Laughter at 33 1/3.
Laughter at 33 1/3. We're going to investigate a whole bunch of the song parodies that had been put on LP or even transferred to LP. Some of the legends, like Mr. Lair and Mr. Sherman, among them, and then there are a few others. So we figured we'd do some sort of humor, something different on a different line. And then when you listen back to some of the stuff, it's so inventive. I mean, the scant, the rhymes, everything fits the songs that they either were parodying or writing. And it's something that was of a generation like when we were growing up at the tail end of the baby boom. But for a period, up until the Kennedy assassination, someone like Alan Sherman was, I think, if I remember correctly, his famous Mudder, Hello Fada, actually was in competition, possibly, was it with the Beatles at a certain point, I think? It had hit like number 2 or 3 in the charts for a number of weeks after it was released in '63. So do join us, provided we don't get snowed out or frozen out in a month, the way the weather's going. And want to thank you all for coming. There are sheets over there, promoting the CD. They're available for sale. We also have a sheet from our Vocal Record Collectors Society, who helps us out, and we help them, advertising each other back. And I'll see you in a month. Thank you.
Thank you.